In a world where survival often depended on rules no one ever explained, there was a classroom unlike any other. The walls weren't lined with posters of alphabets or formulas, but with shadows that seemed to press in closer every day. It wasn't a place where children whispered jokes or passed notes under desks. This class had a single purpose, and everyone inside knew it. They were here to be tested, to be pushed beyond comfort, and to prove whether they had the will to endure what came next. But no one expected the kind of challenge that would shatter the silence and change the course of the day forever. The instructor walked in without greeting anyone, carrying the same cold authority that had grown familiar. The air always shifted when that figure entered, as if even the oxygen knew to hold still. Everyone sat straighter, waiting, uncertain whether today would bring lessons, punishments, or something else entirely. And then the words dropped into the room like a stone in water. "Build a weapon," that was all. No explanation, no context. Just a command that made the students look at one another with a mixture of confusion and unease. At first, no one moved. The idea of weapons carried too much weight. It wasn't about sharp steel or flashing firepower, not here. It was about imagination, desperation, and the choices people made when they had nothing else. Some of the students hesitated, their eyes scanning the empty desks and the bare floor. Others glanced toward the corners of the room, searching for something, anything, that could be bent into a tool of survival. The tension thickened as minutes stretched, and silence became louder than any voice. It wasn't until one student stood up that the room truly changed. There was nothing dramatic about the movement, but there was something sharp in the determination behind it. While the others looked for scraps or waited for guidance, this one reached under the chair. The sound of wood creaking filled the room as a leg was pulled loose with steady force. Gasps spread through the class. It was reckless, bold, and yet undeniably simple. With one sharp crack, the chair gave way, and the piece of wood was suddenly no longer part of furniture. It was something else entirely. In the dim light, the student held it up, gripping it tightly, and then with a voice calm enough to silence the whispers, declared, "This is a spear." It wasn't perfect. Not carved or polished, but in that moment, no one could argue with the truth of it. It had shape, intent, and more importantly, purpose. The room went quiet, every gaze locked on the makeshift weapon. What had seemed impossible seconds before was now real, undeniable, and it made the others shift uncomfortably in their seats. The instructor said nothing at first, but the faintest shadow of a smirk crossed their face. The class had been told to build a weapon, and someone had already done it, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the instinct to act. That single choice pulled an invisible line across the room, dividing those who waited for permission from those who seized it. And though no one admitted it out loud, everyone knew things would never feel the same again. Whispers soon rose among the others, quiet at first but growing louder. Some leaned forward, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Others pulled back, unsettled by how quickly a simple piece of furniture had transformed into something dangerous. The air buzzed with unspoken questions. Was this allowed? Was it too much? Would it draw punishment or praise? The uncertainty made it harder to breathe, yet also harder to look away. The instructor finally stepped closer, circling the one who held the chair leg. Their boots echoed against the floor with each step, making the silence even sharper. "A spear?" They repeated slowly, their tone unreadable. The student didn't flinch, didn't drop the weapon. Instead, the grip tightened, knuckles paling as the weight of the choice became real. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for what would come next, knowing it could tilt the entire lesson in any direction. This was never about the wood itself. It wasn't about whether the spear could pierce or strike. It was about imagination under pressure, about the courage to act when others froze. It was about the human instinct to adapt, to take what was around them and turn it into something more. In that stripped-down classroom, where walls closed in and silence spoke louder than lectures, the act of snapping a chair leg was more powerful than a textbook ever could be. Some students looked at their own chairs, their eyes tracing the grain of the wood, their fingers itching as if considering whether to follow or resist. Others shook their heads, unwilling to cross the line, afraid of what it might mean. But the moment had already changed them. Once someone dared to act, the others could no longer pretend they hadn't thought of it too. The instructor's expression remained cold, but there was a flicker, something unreadable that passed quickly across their features. Approval, perhaps, or maybe calculation. "And what do you plan to do with your spear?" they asked finally, voice low but carrying through every corner of the room. That was the question that mattered, and the one that no one had an answer to. The student holding the weapon shifted slightly, the weight of the wood now heavier than before. The eyes of the class burned into their back, waiting, measuring, wondering what the next move would be. Would it be to raise the weapon higher, to show it off, to prove strength? Or would it be to lower it, to surrender, to admit the fear that pressed against the ribs with each breath? The moment dragged on, stretching so long that the air seemed to thicken. The classroom, once filled with ordinary silence, now felt like a stage where every heartbeat was amplified. The chair leg, cracked at one end and rough in the hand, was more than just an object now. It was a symbol. A symbol of rebellion, of resourcefulness, of the human refusal to stay still when tested. And whether it would bring respect, punishment, or something far worse, no one yet knew. The students didn't realize it then, but they had all just witnessed the start of something far bigger than a simple classroom task. What seemed like an exercise would soon unravel into a test of loyalty, courage, and survival. The one holding the spear had unknowingly set the tone for everything that would follow. The instructor's eyes narrowed, and the faintest hum of tension seemed to spark in the air. The silence was no longer calm but charged, ready to burst. The class held its breath, every pair of eyes flicking between the weapon, the instructor, and the one who dared to wield it. And then, just as it seemed something would finally snap, the instructor leaned forward slightly, their voice cutting through the tension with a single phrase. "Show us!" The words fell like a hammer, and the weight of them sent a shiver across the room. What did it mean? Show what? To whom? And at what cost? The one with the spear drew a sharp breath, realizing that there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would decide more than just the success of the assignment. It would decide everything. The class waited in silence, the air thick with suspense, every heart pounding in rhythm with the unknown that loomed ahead. And in that moment, the story had only just begun. The room had fallen into a silence so sharp it seemed to hum in the air. The students still held the chair leg firmly, the rough wood pressed into their palm, splinters biting into skin as if the object itself demanded seriousness. Everyone leaned forward ever so slightly, waiting. The instructor's command, "Show us," echoing in the space like a bell that couldn't be unheard. No one wanted to move first. No one wanted to breathe too loudly. Every second stretched into something heavier than the last. And yet, it was clear. Something bigger than a simple classroom exercise had already begun. But before anyone could act, the silence gave way to thoughts that pulled the students back through their own memories. Each one of them knew this wasn't the first strange task they had been given, though it was perhaps the most direct. They remembered the first day stepping into this room, the way the door had closed behind them with a sound that promised there was no easy way out. The air smelled faintly of dust and metal. The walls seemed too clean, too empty, as if designed to strip away distractions. Even the windows, narrow and high, let in only enough light to remind them there was a world outside they could not reach. From the beginning, the lessons had been different. There were no lectures on history, no pages of math, no poems to memorize. Instead, the students were given challenges, strange, simple on the surface, yet always heavy with unspoken meaning. Carry a bucket of water without spilling a drop. Stay awake in total silence for hours. Choose 3 items from a box, not knowing what they were for. Each task seemed designed to press them, to study how they thought, how they endured, how they broke. Some students handled it better than others. Some faltered early. But all of them, in one way or another, had stayed, because leaving was never really an option. The one holding the spear-like chair leg had always been different. Quiet, but not timid. Observant, often the first to notice the patterns others missed. It wasn't surprising in hindsight that when told to build a weapon, this student had acted before anyone else. Yet what lingered now was not just admiration from some and unease from others. It was fear of what the act implied. Because if a weapon could be made so quickly from something as ordinary as a chair, then what else could be transformed in this room? What else could be turned against them? The instructor's eyes swept over the class slowly, pausing on each face. No words, just a heavy gaze that seemed to peel back layers of hesitation. No one dared to ask what "show us" meant, though the question clawed at their minds. Was the student expected to demonstrate strength? Was the weapon meant for attack, defense, or simply proof of imagination? The uncertainty made everyone restless. Someone at the back of the room shifted nervously, their chair legs scraping the floor in a harsh squeal that made everyone flinch. The sound broke the stillness, reminding them all how fragile the moment was. Another student folded their arms tightly, as though bracing against a storm. A third leaned forward, their curiosity nearly as sharp as the tension. In truth, most of the students had grown used to living in shadows of half-answers. The instructors never explained why they were there, or what the end of all this would be. Every day felt like walking into another test without knowing the rules. Some whispered that this was training for something bigger, though none of them dared to guess what. Others thought it was punishment, or a kind of preparation for trials beyond the walls. Whatever the truth was, it kept them tethered together, bound not by friendship, but by the weight of unanswered questions. The wooden spear now stood at the center of it all. Not polished, not even truly sharp, but a symbol. A reminder that in a place where everything was stripped away, humans would still create, still adapt, still turn the ordinary into survival. The instructor's slight smirk earlier hadn't gone unnoticed either. It hinted that this was what they had been waiting for, not hesitation, but instinct. Yet the danger of instinct was that it spread. A ripple had already begun. Some students' eyes darted to their own chairs, hands resting on the smooth wood as though considering if they should follow. The possibility flickered across the room like sparks in dry grass. If one weapon could be made, why not more? But the silence of the instructor kept them frozen, uncertain whether another act would be seen as initiative or defiance. The student holding the weapon felt the weight of every gaze. Each breath grew harder, the air thick, the room too small. It wasn't just a piece of wood anymore. It was a decision, one that carried unseen consequences. The student's grip tightened, and though no words escaped their lips, the thought ran clear. What do they want me to prove? And so the tension stretched on. Seconds felt like hours. Every face revealed something different: fear, fascination, suspicion. Some looked ready to bolt if things turned violent. Others leaned in, hungry to see how far this strange lesson would go. For the first time, the students weren't just passive watchers of a test. They were part of it. Pulled into the invisible line drawn the moment that chair leg snapped free. The instructor finally moved again, pacing slowly, each step deliberate. Their voice, when it came, was soft but piercing. You've shown you can create, but can you decide? That word, decide, echoed just as powerfully as "show us." It made the class realize this wasn't just about building a weapon. It was about choices. Who would use it? Who would refuse it? Who would stand firm when the rules were unclear? No one knew how far the game would go, but everyone understood one truth in that moment. The classroom was no longer just a room. It was a stage where human instinct, creativity, and fear were colliding. The lesson wasn't about wood or tools. It was about survival and how far they were willing to go when pressed against uncertainty. The quiet student at the back finally whispered under their breath, too low for the instructor to hear, but just enough for those nearby. It's not the spear that matters. It's what happens next. And that was the truth everyone felt, but couldn't say out loud. The one holding the weapon glanced around the room, feeling the weight of invisible eyes more than the wood itself. The spear trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the storm of choices forming all at once. The instructor's silence was not guidance, but a trap, forcing them to move without assurance, without safety. And then, without warning, the door at the far end of the room clicked. A sound so small, yet it sent a chill through the class. It wasn't opening, not yet, but the metallic click was clear. Someone beyond the walls had just unlocked it. Everyone's attention darted toward it, breaths catching, hearts stuttering. The weapon in the student's hand suddenly felt like both a shield and a target. The instructor turned their head ever so slightly toward the sound, then back toward the class. No explanation, no comfort, just a faint nod as if to say, the real test hasn't even started yet. And in that moment, the class realized something even more unsettling. The weapon wasn't just meant to be built. It was meant to be used. Against what or who, they didn't yet know. The tension did not break. It only deepened, stretching the silence into something alive, something electric. The students sat frozen between fear and curiosity, their futures tangled in the single decision of one who had dared to act first. The unlocked door stayed closed, but the promise of what lay beyond it was enough to make every heartbeat race. The spear was ready, the class was waiting, and the story of what would happen next was only just beginning. The click of the lock lingered in the air long after it faded. Every student sat frozen, listening, waiting for the next sound. Nothing came. The door stayed closed, but its presence now felt heavier, almost alive. It was no longer just an exit they could never reach. It was an invitation. Or maybe a threat. No one could tell. The silence stretched until even the smallest shift of weight, the smallest breath seemed louder than it should have been. The one holding the spear tightened their grip, knuckles pale against the wood. The room had grown smaller somehow, walls pressing inward, tension squeezing the air out of their lungs. Across the rows, some students leaned forward, restless, their eyes darting from the instructor to the weapon to the door. Others sat rigid, arms folded as though anchoring themselves in place, unwilling to be the first to move. Each second wound them tighter, like a rope pulled to its limit. One thread away from snapping, the instructor's gaze swept across the room again, unreadable as ever, and then returned to the student with the spear. There was no spoken command this time, just silence, heavy and intentional. That silence was worse than words. It forced everyone to fill the gap with their own fears. A student near the front whispered, "Why unlock it if they don't open it?" The words were barely audible, but they rippled across the room. The question sat there, unanswerable, making the air thicker. Another leaned sideways and muttered, "Maybe something's waiting on the other side." That suggestion made every heartbeat faster. Suddenly, the locked door wasn't just a door. It was a boundary between what they feared and what they could not yet see. The spear holder shifted slightly, the wood scraping softly against their palm. That small sound caught everyone's attention, like a spark in dry silence. The instructor tilted their head the slightest bit, as though waiting for the choice they all knew was coming. Go to the door or stay. Show courage or hesitate. Act or freeze. The problem was that every choice carried risk. To move might mean walking into something they weren't ready for. To stay might mean failing a test they didn't fully understand. The tension became unbearable, dragging at every thought, stretching out each second until the stillness felt like suffocation. One of the quieter students finally raised their hand, voice shaking as they asked, "Is this part of it?" The instructor gave no answer, only a faint narrowing of the eyes, a look that said more than words could. They weren't going to explain. They never did. This was the test, and the test was the silence itself. The spear holder took one step forward, just one. The floor creaked beneath their weight, the sound sharp and startling in the dead air. The entire class seemed to inhale at once. Even the instructor's eyes followed the movement closely. That step toward the door wasn't just movement, it was a decision. A decision everyone else was suddenly tangled up in, whether they liked it or not. The student paused, feeling dozens of eyes burning into their back. The spear felt heavier than before, almost dragging their arm down, but they held it steady. Each breath now came shallow and uneven, but still, they did not move back. Another step followed. Then another. The distance between the rows of chairs and the door was shrinking, yet the space felt endless. With each step, the anticipation in the room swelled, pressing down on everyone until it was almost unbearable. Students clutched the edges of their desks, some chewing their lips, some leaning so far forward it seemed they might collapse. The air was alive with unspoken questions. Would the door open? What was behind it? Would the weapon be enough? The spear holder stopped just short of the door, their hand hovering uncertainly near the handle. The wood trembled slightly in their grip now, not from weakness, but from the sheer magnitude of the unknown that stood one touch away. Behind them, someone whispered too loudly, "Don't do it," another countered. "They have to." The voices cracked the silence, fueling the tension further. The class was no longer just watching, they were dividing. Some wanted to see what happened, no matter the cost. Others wanted to stop it before something they couldn't take back unfolded. That quiet fracture in the group only deepened the sense that something irreversible was coming. The instructor still hadn't spoken, hadn't moved closer, hadn't lifted a hand to guide or stop. Their stillness was more terrifying than action. It was as though they were watching not a class, but an experiment, waiting to see which choice human instinct would carve out of fear. The hand holding the spear lowered to the side, the other hand rising toward the cold metal of the door handle. Fingers hovered there for a long moment, not touching, just trembling in the space between safety and whatever lay beyond. The silence in the room reached its peak, heavy enough to make ears ring, and then the handle shifted. Not from the student's hand, but from the other side. Gasps filled the room, sharp and unrestrained. The spearholder recoiled slightly, but didn't back away completely. Their grip on the wood tightened again, pulse hammering in their throat. The door creaked softly as though something beyond was pressing, testing, waiting. The unlocked door had not been forgotten after all. Something or someone was there. The class erupted in whispers, fear mixing with curiosity. "It's opening!" one student hissed, but they were silenced by the sudden hush that swept back through the room. Every set of eyes, wide and unblinking, was glued to the door. The instructor finally spoke, voice calm but edged with something deliberate. "Now you will learn why you were told to build a weapon." The words froze the air. They confirmed what everyone feared. This was never just a task. It was preparation for this very moment. The door creaked again, opening just a fraction of an inch before falling still. That gap was enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond, deeper and heavier than the shadows in the room. The unknown pressed against the crack, a presence felt more than seen. The students shifted uneasily, hearts racing, thoughts spinning. The spearholder stood firm, though their breath came fast, shoulders tense. The weapon was no longer just an act of rebellion or creativity, it was survival. The instructor's words still echoed, making it clear. Something was coming, and none of them were ready. Every second dragged now like an eternity. Some students leaned back, as though distance from the door would protect them. Others leaned forward, almost drawn to the danger, needing to see what would step through. The air buzzed with tension, humming in their ears, pounding in their chests. The handle rattled again, more firmly this time. The spearholder flinched but didn't back away. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to retreat, but something else held them steady. The knowledge that the class was watching, relying, waiting to see who would act. The responsibility weighed heavier than the wood itself. The instructor's gaze sharpened. They didn't move to help, didn't warn, didn't stop. Their stillness was a command in itself. Face what comes. The door shuddered once more, then stilled. The silence afterward was unbearable. The spearholder's breath hitched, the class leaned in, and the darkness in the cracks seemed to pulse, waiting, almost breathing with them. The suspense was unbearable, a storm pressed against thin walls. Something was going to break soon. The students knew it. The instructor knew it, and the one gripping the spear could feel it in their bones. One final twist of the handle echoed through the room. The door began to open, and with it, everything they thought they understood about their test and about themselves was about to change. The door swung open slowly, hinges groaning as if reluctant to reveal what waited beyond. Every student leaned forward unconsciously, hearts thundering in unison. The gap widened inch by inch, and with each creak, the tension thickened until it felt impossible to breathe. The spearholder stood frozen, weapon raised slightly, caught between fear and determination. Behind them, the class shifted uneasily, whispers dying in throats, every pair of eyes locked on the widening shadow. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. The room's dim light stretched toward the hallway like a weak beam, swallowed almost immediately by the black beyond. It wasn't empty, not really. There was a sense of presence in that void, something unseen pressing against their minds like a hand resting just out of sight. Some students leaned back, chairs scraping nervously, while others gripped their desks so tightly their knuckles turned white. And then, unexpectedly, the second twist struck. The instructor didn't stop the door. Instead, they stepped back, their voice low but steady. "What you fear is not behind the door. What you fear is already here." The words landed like a strike. Every student turned sharply toward the instructor, eyes wide, confusion mixing with dread. "Already here?" The phrase rippled through their thoughts, making the shadows in the corners of the classroom feel suddenly deeper, the silence suddenly sharper. Some students began glancing at one another, suspicion flickering in their eyes. The spear holder's grip trembled, not from weakness, but from the sudden realization that the threat might not be outside waiting to come in. It might be inside, among them. One student near the middle row broke the silence with a shaky voice. "What do you mean already here?" But the instructor gave no answer. Their expression was unreadable, eyes scanning the class like someone measuring invisible weight. That single line had done more than any open door could. It had cracked the trust that barely held the group together. Suddenly, every glance felt dangerous. Every movement seemed suspicious. Were they supposed to fear something in the hall, or were they supposed to fear each other? The class grew restless. A student whispered, "It's a trick. They want us to turn on one another." Another hissed back, "Or maybe someone's hiding something." The tension shifted from fear of the unknown to fear of betrayal. A subtler but sharper blade. The spear holder lowered the weapon slightly, eyes darting between the instructor, the door, and their classmates. The weight of decision grew unbearable. If the danger was truly among them, then who? The room was silent except for uneven breathing, but underneath that silence was a new kind of chaos, paranoia. The door remained open, the hallway yawning dark and wide, but no one dared step through. Instead, their focus turned inward. The threat, real or imagined, was sitting in the same room. That realization was more terrifying than anything outside. The instructor finally spoke again, their tone colder now. "Weapons reveal more than they protect. They expose choices. They expose truth." That sentence cut through the room, feeding the fire of unease. The students began looking at the spear holder differently, not with admiration, but with suspicion. The weapon that had once symbolized resourcefulness now marked them as dangerous. The student at the back, who had whispered earlier about the spear not being the point, leaned forward, their eyes sharp. "They want us to see what we'll do with it." "Who we'll point it at?" That thought took root in everyone's mind, spreading faster than it could be ignored. The spear holder's chest rose and fell quickly now, their arm heavy, their classmates' stares piercing like blades. No one said it outright, but the tension was clear. One weapon, one wielder, and a room full of fear. That combination could not hold for long. The darkness from the hallway seemed to stretch further into the room, as though it fed on the growing paranoia. It wasn't just a doorway anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting the unease back at them, amplifying it. Some students turned their backs to it, unwilling to look. Others stared as if expecting something to step through at any moment. But deep down they all knew the real conflict was now inside the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Just once, but enough to draw gasps. The flicker plunged them into a second of darkness before snapping back on. That single heartbeat of blackness felt endless, and when the light returned, every student looked around frantically, checking, counting, searching. Everyone was still there, but the fear had grown. The instructor didn't flinch at the flicker. They only watched, arms crossed, as though waiting for the inevitable breaking point. Their silence screamed louder than any order could. The student nearest the spear holder finally snapped under the weight of it. "Put it down!" they demanded, voice trembling but loud. "You don't need to hold it anymore." Their words rang in the air, sharp and desperate. Some nodded in agreement, their fear boiling into action. Others stayed quiet, not ready to choose a side. The spear holder shook their head, voice firm, though their chest ached with tension. "If something comes through that door, we'll need it." The statement was reasonable, but it carried another layer everyone heard. "I won't let go." The divide deepened. Half the class leaned toward surrender, wanting safety in disarming. The other half leaned toward resistance, seeing the weapon as protection. The instructor's earlier words about deciding now came alive, twisting the moment into a test not of skill, but of loyalty and courage. The air grew hot with breath, thick with mistrust. Every student now seemed both ally and enemy. The spear holder's arms ached, but they refused to lower it. Behind them, the open door waited, patient, silent, its darkness a reminder that the outside threat still loomed. The flicker came again, twice this time. The lights buzzed angrily, shadows jerking across the walls in uneven bursts. Each flash of darkness made the class flinch, hearts racing faster. It felt like something was moving just out of sight, hiding in the seconds when the lights died. A student in the corner gasped, swearing they saw a shape in the hallway during the flicker. Another argued they saw nothing. The whispers turned frantic, overlapping, until the classroom buzzed with panic. The weapon now seemed less like an object of survival and more like a fuse waiting to be lit. The instructor finally uncrossed their arms, stepping forward with deliberate calm. Their eyes locked on the spear holder. "Soon," they said quietly, "you will have to choose where to point it." That single sentence silenced the room again, but the silence was not empty this time. It was full of dread, suspicion, and the heavy realization that the next choice would change everything. The door stayed open. The lights flickered. The air throbbed with mistrust. And the weapon, rough and splintered, shook in the spear holder's grip as the weight of the moment bore down harder and harder. No one dared to move, but everyone knew the truth. The real test had begun, and there was no turning back. And then the lights went out completely. The lights cut out with a snap that left the room swallowed in complete darkness. The shift was instant and absolute, like someone had pulled the entire world away and replaced it with a void. A wave of gasps filled the air. Chairs scraped. Someone stifled a cry. In that pitch-black silence, every sound became louder, every breath harsher. The students were no longer looking at one another. They couldn't. Now all they had was instinct, imagination, and fear. The spear holder stood frozen, the rough wood trembling in their grip. They could hear the shuffling of their classmates, their whispered, panicked words, the uncertain breaths that sounded closer than they should. Without sight, suspicion became unbearable. Were they moving away? Were they circling closer? Was someone reaching out not as a friend, but as a threat? Then came the sound, not from the students, but from the open door. A slow drag, something heavy brushing against the floor, steady and deliberate. It was real, not imagined. The thing they had feared beyond the threshold had entered. Every heart in the room seemed to stop at once. The instructor's voice rang out in the darkness, calm and sharp as ever. "Now you will see what fear does. Now you will choose." The words cracked through the chaos, turning the tension into something that demanded action. The dragging sound grew closer, echoing into the classroom, impossible to pinpoint. The students clutched their desks, whispered, frantically, some pleading for light, others begging the spear holder to act. And then, another flicker. For the briefest fraction of a second, the lights sparked back on, revealing a distorted silhouette in the doorway. Tall, uneven, its shadow stretched across the wall like something not entirely human. And then darkness again. The room erupted in screams. Some students leapt from their chairs. Others stumbled backward. A few pressed into corners as though walls could save them. The spear holder's heart hammered, every instinct screaming to thrust the weapon forward. But against what? Against who? In the dark, even friends could become enemies. The dragging sound came faster now, louder, filling the classroom with dread. The spear holder raised the wood higher, trying to steady their breath. Then another flicker of light. This time the shadow was closer, too close, its shape leaning forward as if reaching into the room. But what no one expected was what the flicker revealed behind them. The instructor wasn't watching passively anymore. They were moving too, their expression finally breaking from calm into something harder to read, something almost eager. The lights cut again and the world fell back into blackness. The dragging sound stopped. For a heartbeat, there was silence, too much silence, and then chaos erupted. A desk toppled with a crash. Someone screamed a name. Footsteps pounded across the floor. Hands shoved, pulled, reached in desperation. In that frenzy, the spear holder acted, swinging the weapon outward in blind instinct. The wood struck something solid with a thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath. But it wasn't the shadow. It was one of the students. A gasp tore through the room. The injured voice cried out in pain, and in that instant, fear shifted into something worse. Blame. The class turned not on the shadow, not on the unseen figure, but on the one who held the weapon. Voices rose, sharp and panicked. "They hit someone! They attacked us!" In the dark, trust shattered completely. The spear holder staggered back, guilt crashing over them even as terror twisted tighter. They hadn't meant to strike a classmate, but in the dark, intent meant nothing. All that mattered was perception, and the perception was now clear. The weapon wasn't protecting them. It was dividing them. The instructor's voice cut through again, sharper than before. "Do you see? Fear will make you turn on one another faster than any shadow can." Another flicker. The lights burst back for a moment, long enough for the truth to be seen. The shadow in the doorway was nothing more than a shape, an object dragged along the ground, placed there to spark panic. It was never alive, never real. The real test had been them all along. The students froze, realizing the chaos had come not from outside, but from inside their own choices. The injured student clutched their arm, glaring at the spear holder. Others stared wide-eyed, horrified by what they had done to each other. The flicker vanished again, plunging them back into blackness. But the truth had already settled in the pit of their stomachs. And then, when the silence seemed unbearable, the lights returned fully, steady this time. The room looked smaller now, stripped of illusion. The dragged object lay harmless near the door, a piece of broken metal chained to the floor. The students blinked against the harsh brightness, but their expressions were pale, shaken. The instructor stood tall, surveying the aftermath. "You have learned the truth. The enemy is not outside. The enemy is fear, and what it makes you do." Their words rang final, but the weight of them only deepened the students' unease. The spear holder lowered the weapon, shame pressing heavier than the wood. Around them, classmates avoided their eyes or worse, stared with thinly veiled distrust. The bond that once held them together was broken now, fractured into pieces that couldn't be put back so easily. It seemed the lesson was over. The door closed with a heavy thud, locking again with a final metallic click. The dragged object was gone, pulled back into the hallway as though it had never been there. The instructor crossed their arms, the faintest smirk returning. "You were told to build a weapon, and you did. But you see now, it was never about what you built. It was about what it would do to you." The students sat in silence, some trembling, some staring blankly, others seething with quiet anger. The truth was harsh. The weapon hadn't protected them. It had destroyed their unity, left them wounded, suspicious, divided. But just as the room began to settle, just as breaths started to slow, the final twist came. The door unlocked again. This time it wasn't a trick. The metal handle turned smoothly, and the door swung wide open on its own. The hallway beyond was no longer dark. It was lit, glowing with an unfamiliar light that seemed to stretch endlessly. A low hum drifted from it, vibrating faintly through the floor. The instructor's expression changed, and for the first time their composure cracked. They stepped back, eyes narrowing but not in control. "Not prepared," the students noticed instantly. This wasn't part of the test. From the hallway came a sound. Not dragging, not footsteps, but voices. Clear, layered, more than one. They were drawing closer, steady and certain, echoing through the glow. The class stared in silence, the fear from before shifting into something new. Curiosity, dread, anticipation. Whatever was coming wasn't part of the lesson, wasn't part of the plan. It was something else. The spear holder, still clutching the broken chair leg, stared at the light and listened to the voices growing clearer. Their classmates turned too, forgetting for a moment their fractures, their suspicions, their anger, because whatever lay beyond that glowing hallway wasn't an illusion. It was real, and it was stepping closer. The light from the hallway grew stronger, spilling into the room until the walls and faces of the students looked softer, almost unreal. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. They had already been broken down by fear, tested until their bonds crumbled. And now something new stood waiting for them, its glow pulling their attention like a tide. The voices became clearer, not threatening, but layered and strange, like dozens of people speaking at once. The instructor, who until this moment had seemed so calm and in control, finally showed uncertainty. Their eyes darted toward the glow as though calculating something they hadn't planned for. "Stay where you are," they ordered, but their voice carried less strength now. The students heard the crack in it. They weren't convinced. The spear holder, gripping the broken chair leg tighter, glanced around at their classmates. Despite the earlier mistrust and the wound they had caused, something had shifted. Everyone knew deep down that this wasn't another test. This wasn't part of the illusion. Whatever was out there was real, and for the first time since the fear began, the group seemed to understand that they would have to face it together. The voices grew louder, clearer now, weaving into actual words. They weren't angry. They weren't even demanding. They sounded curious, inviting, like someone waiting for an answer. The glow flickered as if alive, beckoning them. The injured student, still holding their arm, broke the silence. What if this is what we were really meant to see? Their voice trembled, but the question carried weight. Others exchanged uncertain looks. The instructor shook their head sharply. "No, the lesson is complete. Sit down. Do not move." But this time the authority in their tone didn't land, because the class had seen too much. The spear holder was the first to take a step forward. The others watched, caught between suspicion and a faint pull of hope. With each step closer to the doorway, the glow warmed, no longer blinding but soft, like sunrise breaking through a long night. The voices steadied, their tone clearer now, encouraging, urging them onward. One by one, the other students began to rise. Chairs scraped against the floor. Shoes scuffed against the tiles. Even those who had been huddled in corners moved closer to the light. Fear was still there, but it had shifted. It no longer held them apart. Instead, it seemed to press them together, pushing them to move as one. The instructor backed away, their expression unreadable. For the first time, they weren't the guide. They weren't in control. Whatever the hallway was, it wasn't part of their lesson, and that terrified them more than anything else. The class reached the threshold, all eyes fixed on the glowing corridor. The spear holder stood in front, their makeshift weapon lowered, no longer raised to strike but held steady like a reminder of where they had come from. They glanced back at their classmates, seeing not suspicion or anger now, but silent agreement. Despite everything that had happened, they would step into this unknown together. When they crossed the doorway, the glow wrapped around them like a wave of warmth. The voices became clearer, gentle, layered, speaking words they didn't understand but could somehow feel. Words that carried reassurance, curiosity, and even welcome. It was unlike anything they had ever known. As they walked deeper, the hallway stretched wider, opening into a space that seemed endless. No longer a sterile classroom with walls and ceilings, but something vast, filled with shifting light and shapes that moved like living constellations. The students stared in awe, their fear fading into wonder. The injured one let their arm hang loosely, forgetting the pain. The quietest of them, who hadn't spoken all day, whispered, "We were never trapped. We were being shown the way." The instructor appeared behind them in the doorway, framed by the dimmer classroom light. For once, they didn't speak. They only watched, their lips pressed thin, as though unsure if this moment was a triumph or a loss. The class didn't wait for them. They kept moving forward. The voices around them shifted, finally forming into a single phrase they could understand. "You chose." The words echoed through the vast space, soft yet final, and in that moment, the students realized the test had never been about building a weapon. It had been about what they would do when something larger than themselves appeared. Would they fall apart under fear, or would they find a way to move forward despite it? The spear holder loosened their grip and let the broken chair leg fall to the ground. The sound echoed softly, not as a failure but as closure. The weapon that once divided them was no longer needed. Together, the group walked deeper into the light, until the classroom behind them seemed like a distant memory. The fear, the suspicion, the chaos, it had been real, but it no longer defined them. They were different now. Not just students who had been told to build something, but people who had seen what fear could create and had chosen to step beyond it. When the glow finally softened, they found themselves standing in a new room. Not endless, not overwhelming, but calm and familiar. Windows stretched across the walls, showing a sky painted with colors they had never seen before. Soft golds, deep blues, shimmering hues that shifted like water. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. For the first time since the challenge began, they felt safe. The voices faded into silence, leaving only their own breathing and the distant sound of wind beyond the windows. One of the students laughed softly, a laugh that carried relief. Another sank to the floor, tears rolling down their cheeks. The injured one turned to the spear holder and simply nodded. A quiet forgiveness. They didn't need anyone to tell them what the lesson had been. They understood it now. A weapon was easy to build. Fear was easy to surrender to. But finding a way to stand together, that was the real challenge. And they had found it, even if it took being broken first. The instructor eventually entered, but they said nothing. They looked at the windows, the light, the students who no longer seemed afraid of them, and their silence spoke louder than any lecture. The class no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the ones who had faced fear and stepped through it. As the story closed, the students stood by the windows, staring out at a horizon that promised something bigger than tests and trials. They didn't know what waited for them beyond, but for once not knowing didn't feel like a threat. It felt like freedom. And in that moment, they realized the truth that would stay with them long after the classroom, the light and the shadows were gone. The real weapon wasn't the chair leg or any object they could break and shape. The real weapon was unity. It was trust. It was the choice to walk into the unknown side by side even when fear tried to tear them apart. The lesson was finished, but the journey was only beginning. And though the hallway had vanished behind them, its glow lingered in their minds, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a door waiting to be opened.